Good evening and welcome to the College of Education Winter 2025 Education Issues Forum. Thank you all for joining us. This is the 14th year of the forums, and we've covered an impressive range of current and critical topics. We have just an incredible panel for you this evening, and the topic could not be more crucial as we discuss the Trump administration's plans for public education. Thank you very much to Dr. Carol Burris and Dr. Julian Vesquez-Heilig for joining us and sharing your wisdom. One of the most important roles we play as educators is education toward engaged democracy. Franklin D. Roosevelt reminded us that democracy cannot succeed unless those who express their choice are prepared to choose wisely. The real safeguard of democracy is, therefore, education. And Nelson Mandela reminds us that an educated, enlightened, and informed population is one of the surest ways of promoting the health of a democracy. This means it's our responsibility to promote student learning toward becoming active, engaged, critical, and informed citizens. We must educate toward active democracy rather than passive democracy. We must impart the responsibility to understand, gain knowledge, and be responsible toward the betterment of our local communities, our world, and our future. I would like to take a quick minute to thank Diane Horowitz and Maya Mushitz, without whose dedication, hard work, and incredible organizational skills we would not be here. Diane has been a tireless sponsor and champion to these forums for many years, and we greatly appreciate her service. I'm also obligated to note that the views expressed in this forum are those of the speakers and participants, and theirs alone, and not necessarily those of DePaul University. I hand things over now to the amazing Dr. Sonia Soltero. She's a nationally recognized scholar and teacher in bilingual education and equity in education. And in our college, she serves as the chair of our Department of Leadership, Language, and Curriculum.
Thank you very much for that kind presentation. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you especially to Dr. Burris and Dr. Julian Vesquez-Heilig. And good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. We are thrilled, we're more than thrilled to have over 700 participants who have registered for our event today, including DePaul students and faculty, many K-12 teachers, faculty from community colleges and universities around the area and around the state, school and district leaders, community activists, non-for-profit organizations, and many others. A real testament in terms of the registration numbers to the widespread interest in and concern about the current political climate. And we're so proud of being in our 14th year of organizing these quarterly forums on the many education matters critical to us as a whole and to the public. And again, thank you to Diane and Maya. A word about this evening's format. I will first provide a brief introduction, followed by interviews of our two esteemed education policy experts, Dr. Carol Burris and Dr. Julian Vesquez-Heilig. And then I will pass the baton on to Diane, who will introduce three respondents who will offer concrete suggestions on how to respond to the current administration's actions and policies. We may go, just in case, but you may leave, we may go over the 7 o'clock time frame that we put for ourselves. So maybe we may go over 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how the conversation goes. So before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the current crisis and suffering that many groups across the United States are experiencing, including immigrant communities, families, and children. We know that the vitality of the United States has always been renewed and strengthened by immigration, by many other things, but immigration is a key component. DePaul University and the College of Education upholds the dignity, as many others, and human rights of all people, per our Vincentian mission, especially those who are most vulnerable among us. And we reaffirm and commit to the undocumented immigrant origin, international and refugee students, children, and their families and communities. We will continue to work toward positive systemic change through our research and our teaching and our community engagement, while also collaborating with local organizations that protect and empower immigrant families and many other targeted groups. So the backdrop for tonight's forum is the monumental and profound shifts in policies and actions that are coming from the new administration. These are unprecedented times, both in the speed by which the executive branch has issued a torrent of executive orders, terminated large numbers of government employees, and reversed longstanding policies across the board. Clearly, these are mandates and directives. These mandates and directives have immediate, immense, and long-lasting effects on communities, agencies, local governments, P-12 education system, and higher education in this country. The legislation to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education, the executive orders banning DEI initiatives and programs, move to privatize public education, and increasing threats against universities and P-12 schools are among but a few of the many strikes that are felt in the education world in the US. So the goal of tonight's forum is to help us understand the background, the context, the origins and purpose of these policies and actions, and as a result, to better be informed on how to respond. We must be involved as teachers, as parents, as counselors and educational leaders, students, and as engaged members of society in general to counter these headwinds. To that end, the last 15 minutes of our forum tonight, we'll hear from 3 colleagues offering ideas on what we can do. And now I am honored to introduce our first distinguished speaker, Carol Burris, who is the Executive Director of the Network for Public Education, a national organization dedicated to support and improve public education. Carol served as principal of Southside High School in Rockville Center, New York, from 2000 to 2015. She received her doctorate from Teachers College in 2003. Her dissertation on the long-term effects of accelerating all students in middle school math to increase the achievement of students of color won the NASSP Dissertation of the Year Award. In 2010, she was recognized by New York School Administrators Association as the Outstanding Educator of the Year. And in 2013, she was again recognized by NASSP as the New York State High School Principal of the Year. Carol has co-authored 2 books on educational equity, and her 3rd book, titled On the Same Track, How Schools Can Join the 21st Century Struggle Against Resegregation, is available from Beacon Press. She's the author of, or co-author of numerous journal articles on educational equity, teacher evaluation, and detracting. And with that, we'll begin, and we welcome Carol. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the lovely introduction.
There you are. So let's begin with your thoughts about the importance of public education, the connection between strong public schools and democracy, and how the right is trying to redefine that.
Yeah, it's a great place to begin. And I couldn't agree more with the remarks that your dean just had. Public education is the bedrock of our democracy. You know, our founders realized that unless you have a well-educated public, democracy cannot flourish. And so our public education system grew, and it grew in a way that it was a reflection of democracy itself in its purest form, what people call traditional public schools. The districts are democratically governed by a community, and they serve all of the children of the community. School boards govern the district with supervision from the state and to a greater and lesser degree from the federal government, with funding generally coming from 3 sources: local sources, state, and federal sources. Now, this kind of a setup is true of many community resources, right? If you think about our local police departments, fire departments, and parks, you see the same kind of local control funding coming from different sources. But yet, public education has been singled out by the right and slapped with a pejorative, government schools. And that's very, very deliberate. So how is it being redefined? Well, we got our first clue perhaps in May of 2019, when then Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, addressed the Education Writers Association conference. And I'm going to read to you now and listen carefully to what she had to say. Let's stop and think the definition of public education. Today, It's often defined as one type of school, funded by taxpayers, controlled by government. But if every student is part of the public, then every way and every place a student learns is ultimately a benefit to the public. That should be the new definition of public education. And when I first read that, it just didn't even make sense to me, logical sense. But, I found myself preparing for tonight, but going back to that definition and seeing how those words were actually very carefully chosen. Because what DeVos was saying is that public education is everything and at the same time, nothing. She highlights the two defining characteristics of public education: governed by the public and publicly funded. And then she dismisses them as unimportant and goes on with her expanded definition. So, if you think of this wide, broad definition of public education as defined by Betsy DeVos, you see, well, what is left? And what's left is an uncontrolled system of education, unregulated, including schools that are not publicly funded. And that is the new definition of public education.
Very enlightening. So you have written extensively about school privatization. How is that connected to the DeVos, what you just mentioned, definition, and where is it now? And what is its ultimate objective? What form does that take at the federal level? For example, what exactly is in Trump's first executive order and the Educational Choice for Children's Act currently being discussed in Congress?
Okay, so let's go back to DeVos's definition. Every way and every place a student is educated is called public education. That's at the heart of the privatization movement, which sees education as a marketplace. So whatever form of educational experience happens, according to DeVos and to the other folks who are basically libertarians, who believe in this view, and it is now the dominant view of one of our political parties. Public education then is charter schools, voucher-funded private schools, online schools, micro schools, or home schools. DeVos would call all of the above public education. Parents, do what you want and hands off by the government. That is essentially the message that parents are being given under the guise of school choice. We know what the first gateway was. The first gateway was charter schools. Schools that are privately governed have some public restrictions put on them, states with varying definitions, some loose, some tight, some allowing for-profit charter education, others not. But essentially, that was the gateway that gave people the idea that, you know what, you don't have to go to your neighborhood school. There's something else that you can have and that you can have for free. Then the second gateway, of course, is the voucher programs, and they're spreading right now all over the country. Even though when they're put up for referendum, there were 3 just this year in Nebraska, Kentucky, and Colorado, the public rejects them. But nevertheless, this is such a strong goal of the right. What's happening is that in red states, voucher legislation is being pushed through. So what before was considered unacceptable now is considered more acceptable and actually polls very well. Even though when people go to the poll, they look at it differently. When you see a public poll, this idea of choice has become very attractive. And voucher systems work in a variety of ways. Some are traditional voucher systems where the money goes directly to the private school. Others are tax credit voucher systems where either corporations or sometimes individuals get a tax credit that's put into a fund, which is then distributed to students to pay for private school tuition. And then the third, which is the most popular, form of voucher, which is embraced by DeVos, by McMahon, and by others, the future Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon. That is the ESC voucher, and that is, in my opinion, the most irresponsible voucher of all. Parents are given money. The ESA voucher stands for Education Savings Account or Scholarship Account, which kind of hides what their intent really is. And then they are allowed to spend money on educational services. It might be private school tuition. It might be homeschooling with a tutoring component. It might be tuition into a micro school. But essentially, they can do what they want with very little oversight, and without having to report, at least in most states, how their child is actually doing. It started in Arizona, and when I first learned about it, I couldn't believe it. You do not have to show that your child learned. You get the money, but you do not even have to provide an essay or a portfolio of work, and certainly they don't have to take a standardized test. The only thing that you need to do to make sure you get the voucher the following year is spend all of the money the year before. So this is the kind of a system, sometimes called backpack funding, that they want us to move toward. But what's really important for everyone to understand is that even if every state right now had charter schools, had vouchers, had funded homeschooling, even if every state had it, that would not be the end of the game. It would be halftime, because the ultimate goal is for every parent to figure out and fund their own child's education for themselves. And this has been the true Milton Friedman playbook since the 1950s. Where this is all going is to get to a point where parents get some funds to shop for a school and then gradually withdraw the funds so that you have a system similar to what we have in colleges, where you can maybe afford to go to college or not afford to go to college. And there have even been people on the right who've suggested that we no longer need compulsory education in the United States. So, I mean, I know that that sounds very radical, but it's really important to understand, because I get very frustrated when people say, well, I'm against vouchers, but I'm okay with charter schools, or I'm for vouchers, but gee, I don't want homeschools. What you need to understand is the entire system of public education, public support for education is under attack. And all of these different vehicles, all of these different, as Betsy DeVos put it, in every way and in every place, the whole purpose of it is eventually to make public education and something that families have to figure out for themselves and pay for themselves. And there's writings that I could even share with you where this has actually been put in print. Now, they're not going to say that out loud because that would be incredibly unpopular. So what they've done now in the privatization school choice movement is they wrap this up in the rhetoric of school choice. They wrap it up in cute terms like backpack funding. And by using terms like that, they get public buy-in with this gradual, and what will be a gradual erosion of public support for our families and for our children.
So thank you for deconstructing what it really means and what is meant by school choice and educational freedom and parents' rights. And it's interesting, there's zero accountability, whereas for public schools, there is hyper accountability. So very, very disconcerting. So where does the blueprint for the DOE under Trump come? And who are the organizations and forces behind these policies, and what are their goals? What's the end game here? And how is the future, it looks like, future DOE, Secretary of DOE, Linda McMahon, connected? How is all this connected?
Right. Well, certainly part of the blueprint is something that I think everyone's familiar with, and that's Project 2025. Um, President Trump got some distance from it because the public was outraged when they read it. But the playbook that we're seeing is what was in Project 2025 and essentially was repeated in another document called America First. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. The prime movers and shakers, well, the Heritage Foundation has certainly been one of the prime movers and shakers, and they were, of course, the authors of Project 2025. Um, and there are a variety of other nonprofit organizations who have served as think tanks and proponents of school privatization and sort of turning back the clock on progressive policies in schools for years. For example, you have EdChoice. EdChoice used to be called the Friedman Foundation, Milton Friedman being the father of the voucher movement. Um, and they have put out all of these policies for years. You have ALEC. ALEC is part of this. You have the Koch brothers that are putting in a lot of funding into the privatization movement. In fact, it's interesting. There was a point in time where the Kochs ignored education, and then somehow public education got on their radar. And when that happened, that was when I saw the voucher movement really accelerating and taking off. The Goldwater Institute in Arizona really, that was the organization that was behind the push for ESA vouchers in that state. They were the first state to adopt the ESA voucher. And there's always the same pattern, whether it's a tax credit, whether it's a traditional voucher or an ESA, or whether it's the idea that's now been floated in the federal government for a tax credit as well. And it's always what I call the camel's nose under the tent. So when they started, for example, in Arizona, they would pick a group of students that everyone would feel great sympathy for, students with disabilities, the children of our service members. And they would say, well, these scholarships and these savings accounts, it's just for them to get them out of failing schools, right? Because that's part of, along with the pejorative of government schools, the other adjective is failing public schools, right? And unfortunately, I don't think we've pushed back hard enough on that, but that's a story for another day. But they'll start with these sympathetic groups and then they expand them. Well, okay, we're also going to add um, students whose parents have an income that's only twice the poverty level. Then it becomes 3 times the poverty level. And then before you know it, you have a system where everyone can get one of these ESA vouchers, including people who have always sent their children to private schools. And it's been fascinating because we've been watching this as it expands in states. And what you see is you don't see this great increase in private school enrollment. So what's happening is this is all a gift of public funds, right? Where people who could well afford to send their children to private schools are now getting this subsidy. And where is the money coming from? Well, we know it's coming from public schools. It's leaving behind stranded costs. And in a world of limited resources, public school funding gets capped or slowed down or gets cut in order to fund these other programs. So you have in a state like Arizona, three robust education systems. You have the public school system, you have the charter school system, which is huge and which has schools that constantly fail. And then you also have the ESA voucher system. And behind all of this is really, these libertarian billionaire donors who just really do not believe that there is a real reason to have a public school system, that the marketplace, both for profit and nonprofit, will take care of it all, and who really don't believe that the public should be paying for public education in the first place. Now, when we get to Linda McMahon is the chair of the American First agenda in the America First Policy Institute. And what the America First Policy Institute was, essentially, it was a holding tank for more former members of the first Trump administration. And they were able to stay on salary, and their job was to prepare for the second coming of Donald Trump.
And here we are.
And here we
And
are.
here we are.
And they had a lot of time to prepare and a lot of money to do it. And so that agenda is very similar to the agenda that you see in Project 2025. It first talks about choice as the most important aspect of what the school should be doing, or what the administration should be doing. And then it wraps everything up in the rights of parents to control public schools, feeding misinformation and exerting extreme micromanagement. For example, saying things like no federal funding for schools that do not teach correct history in the 1776 curriculum. So you have this strange kind of moment where you have the Trump administration talking about destroying the Department of Education, while at the same time talking about micromanaging what's happening in your local public schools.
And using it as a weapon, weaponizing the Department of Education. So we have 10 minutes left, and I have a three-part question for you. So the first part, the functions of the U.S. Department of Education are varied. Can you please explain what the DOE does that impacts the daily lives of students, teachers, and researchers? Second part of that question, why does the Trump administration want to eliminate it? And we started talking about that in a moment recently. What might that mean? And then thirdly, an important aspect of the administration's plan is to turn federal funding over to the states in the form of block grants. And what would this mean? Can you touch on implications for special education, for example, and other groups?
Sure. Now, the Republican Party has opposed the Department of Education since it was established, or the modern Department of Education since it was established during the Carter years. Even though it's kind of interesting because the greatest expansion of its power came under Republican President George W. Bush, right? Everybody remembers No Child Left Behind, that none of us have recovered from. So it's sort of interesting in that regard. So traditionally, there has been this belief that that particular department shouldn't exist. And I think that's what's happened under the Trump administration, is that philosophy has just carried through. Now, I will be the first one to say I have had my quarrels with the Department of Education. I was not fond of Race to the Top. I thought that was a huge mistake. And nor am I a fan of the federal charter school program, which I think has done more damage to public education than probably any other federal program has, with the exception maybe of NCLB. But nevertheless, the department does have some very important functions. Now, one of those functions is research and data. Because the United States has a highly decentralized system of schooling, we want to be able to create coherent, aligned, comprehensive data on how well that decentralized system is doing. And that takes a really active federal role in order to be able to do that. And so one of the functions of the department is the establishment and the curating of the National Center for Education Statistics. Through NCES, it keeps what's called the Common Core of Data. And I love the Common Core of Data. I use it all of the time. And you can mine it to find so many important and interesting ways to compare how education is being delivered across the states. So what happens essentially is that into the Common Core of Data for public education, all charter schools and all public schools send important data to the state. The state then submits it to the Department of Education. It has demographic data, for example, that shows the racial demographics of the school, the percentage of kids that are on free lunch, reduced price lunch. It shows whether the school is a charter school, whether it's a public school, just what the enrollment looks like, just an important source of data, class size data, number of teachers, number of students. This is data that has been incredibly important for researchers. This another important function of that department is something we all know, the National Assessment of Education Progress, or NAEP, right? Which has been called and heralded as the nation's report card, where tests are given to students at different grade levels, most typically 4, 8, and 12. There's longitudinal data that is kept, and then there's also these snapshots that we have that we can go into it and see, see what we learned really over the past few years. That COVID seemed to have a profound effect on how our students were doing. Now, I think all of us probably knew that it did, but NAEP provides that kind of data. And it's chilling because we've seen research that being done, research funding being canceled already by the Trump administration. NAEP Spring has been canceled, and they have just put the NCES commissioner, Peggy Carr, on leave. So whether or not the Common Core of Data is going to survive, whether or not NAEP is even going to survive, is still an open question. While they're saying that it is, I mean, who knows? They may replace NAEP with the Hillsdale classical test or something else. I mean, it's been really startling because the Common Core of Data, NCES, that's had bipartisan support. There is nothing political about it at all. A second important function is the distribution of congressionally approved funds, which are part of the budget. Congress establishes programs, either they've been established through a congressional act like IDEA or through the Every Student Succeeds Act or its predecessor. And then it's funded by Congress. Even most of the rules as to who gets funding, how much funding they get, all of these things are established by Congress. The department itself is established by Congress. So when Donald Trump says he's going to abolish it, he can only abolish it if the majority of Congress chooses to abolish it. And I believe it would require 60 votes in the Senate. So that's not likely to happen. I'm certain no Democrat would vote to abolish the department. So then you have to say, well, what are they going to be doing with all of this? Now, some of what they're talking about then is taking these funds and bundling them and giving them to the states in block grants. So, for example, Title I would not be administered by the U.S. Department of Education. It would be given to each state to distribute. And that's very scary because one of the most important functions of the department is it puts on the guardrails, right? It puts on the rules and the regulations as to how that money is to be spent to make sure that it's spent properly. Like, for example, right now, Title I funds goes to public schools and it goes to charter schools. So part of the worry is if this is given to a block grant to the state, will this suddenly open it up so that the state can then start giving some of that money to homeschoolers, start giving that money through voucher programs to private schools? I mean, we don't know, and it may turn out to be just fine in some states, maybe just fine in Illinois, but it may not be just fine for the children of Alabama or for the children of Texas or for the children of Florida. And that kind of watchdog guardrail approach that the department takes as it distributes the funds and checks and makes sure that they're being distributed correctly, that will disappear. And then very briefly, a third function is oversight through the Office of Civil Rights and through the Office of Inspector General. And I don't know whether the Education Inspector General is one of the ones that have been fired or not, but I personally love that particular office. I've issued a lot of complaints when I saw, for example, charter school funding being distributed inappropriately, and I've seen the Inspector General step in because they're not political. The heads of the department tend to be political. So there's a lot of important functions, a lot of important reasons to keep the U.S. Department of Education with all of its flaws. But what will happen to it, we don't know. There's already a lot of chatter that IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act funding, children with disabilities, is going to be sent to Health and Human Services. So that worries me a lot, to think that Kennedy Jr., who believes that autism is caused by vaccines, would be in charge of special education funding.
So we're so sorry that time is up. We would like to talk to you for another couple hours. But so we really want to thank you so much, Carol, for a truly enlightening conversation. And thank you again for being with us and sharing your wisdom.
My pleasure.
And with that, I am honored, a real pleasure, to introduce our next distinguished speaker, Dr. Julian Vasquez Heilig. Bienvenido, and thank you for being with us. I will talk a little bit about your background and your bio, and then we'll get going with a conversation. Dr. Vasquez Heilig serves as Professor of Educational Leadership, Research and Technology at Western Michigan University. As a researcher, Vasquez Heilig Scholarship advances equity in K-12 education curriculum, policy, and leadership, focusing on systemic and grassroots innovations. He has published over 70 scholarly publications and has presented at more than 30 universities and 8 countries. Professor Vasquez Heilig has provided expert testimony for state and national legislative bodies, the United Nations, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. He has been a leader in the AACP and has served as education chair for 2 states. Dr. Vasquez Heilig holds a PhD in educational administration and policy analysis, as well as a master's in higher education and sociology from Stanford University. He hosts a website called Cloaking Inequality, which has more than 1 million readers. His recent post on a response to the Dear Colleague letter that was sent out to the universities, which was extremely important, has received widespread attention in the past week, now the past 2 weeks or so. So with that, welcome, and we'll get started. I have a 2-part question, so I'll just read it all, and then you can parse it out as you like. We turn to the executive order on indoctrination.
Mhm.
The administration's attempt to restrict what can be taught, to censor curriculum. There's a lot to unpack here. Can you help us understand what is meant by what they call radical anti-American ideology, discriminatory equity ideology, and how do they use DEI or critical race theory? The document argues to substitute patriotic history and sometimes classical education. What do all these code words means? And the second part of this question, how could this impact teachers' curriculum in K-12 or pre-K-12, especially around race and gender, and how to approach US history? And what about books for school libraries?
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining, allowing me to join you today. And thank you to everyone out there who has joined this conversation. So executive order, indoctrination. Let's start with key terminologies and their meanings. So the first thing you talked about was radical anti-American ideologies. And really, this is vague. It's a politically charged term that has historically been used to discredit discussions about inequity, about injustice, etc. It seems to echo, honestly, McCarthyism. It really frames efforts to discuss challenges that we've had in our history as a nation as an attack on American values, which is undefined in this executive order. And it's being used and can be used to justify the censorship of books. You see this in Florida, justify the censorship of African-American studies. You see that in Texas. And so teachers and courses that challenge the dominant narratives. We have another key term that they talked about, discriminatory equity ideology. So that suggests to the reader that policies aimed at increasing the success of students are actually forms of discrimination. And I think we just have to stop there and say that the work that is focused on increasing graduation rates for African-American students, Latinx students, Native American students, increasing their retention rates, increasing their academic success, that is not discrimination. That is us being invested in the success of all students. And so really, it's a misrepresentation of DEI because it's not efforts about being exclusionary. It's actually efforts to be inclusionary so that all groups, whether they be veterans or Jewish students or students with disabilities or students that are from rural areas, we want to make sure that when they come to our K-12 schools, when they come to higher education, that we are successful. And so really, this is just simply a rhetorical and political tool to roll back the work that we're doing to create success for all students. Now, it also talks about DEI and critical race theory, and I've just actually defined DEI for you, which is the commitment of higher education, the commitment of K-12 to ensure the success of all students, not just a small segment of students. And so these two terms, DEI and CRT or critical race theory, have been turned into these political boogeymen and misrepresented as radical indoctrination rather than academic frameworks that are based on decades of research. Now, I think it's important to say that CRT, where a lot of this conversation started and is really a regurgitation of a conversation that we had back in 2010 and 2011, and then is a regurgitation of a conversation that we had a decade before that. It's not taught in K-12. Kindergartners are not going to learn critical race theory. So I think that's important to say. This comes out of the law field. And so you'll see it in law schools. You could see it in some education research. And essentially what it does is it says that race can be a variable in our research. I think very few people would argue that race shouldn't be a variable that we consider in our research. And so DEI programs are framed as diverse, even though they actually aim to make schools more inclusive, more representative, and to ensure the success of all students. So these are two concepts that have really been turned into political boogeymen. Now, they also frame patriotic history. in classical education. Now, quite frankly, this echoes what governments in China and Russia have been talking about for their higher education curriculum and for their K-12 curriculum. I think Putin recently said that wars are won by teachers. And what that says is that Russia, China, and Hungary and other countries, they want to control the critical thinking and the ability of their citizens to critically think about how their government is framing conversations. And so these ideas, patriotic history, classical education, are just euphemisms for sanitized, nationalistic version of US history that really downplays some of the things that are most challenging in our nation's history. The genocide of Native Americans, slavery. And of course, I think it's important to say slavery is not Black history, it's white history. And so that is something that we as a nation have in common and that we have to grapple with and think about, and our children have to understand. We also have to focus, we also know that they want to focus on these traditional narratives of American exceptionalism while excluding the histories of Indigenous people, of African Americans, and other marginalized perspectives. And so it also aligns with efforts to reintroduce Eurocentric curriculum. When you talk about the classics, when it's Plato or these other things, those are not, do not represent all the communities that we just talked about. It prioritizes Western civilization narratives over multicultural histories. And if you look a little bit more closely at what some of the conversations were in classical education, including in the Greek time, folks might feel a little uncomfortable about some of those perspectives about relationships between teachers and students and some other things. So I actually think that the right wing needs to do a little bit more homework on that, on the whole canon of classical perspectives. Now, the second part to this is you asked about the impact on K-12 curriculum. And so you could see limitations on teaching race and gender. Back in 2011, 2012, we published an article in the Harvard Education Review with my colleagues at UT Austin, Kefferlin and Anthony Brown. And what we talked about how when the standards movement came into being, what that allowed states like Texas to do was make the history of people of color, Native Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, their history became optional in the curriculum when we centralize those decisions with the State Board of Education. And so what you see now is a continuation of that. So teachers may be restricted from discussing systemic racism, white privilege, gender identity, LGBTQ plus issues, anything that someone could see as controversial or could have an emotional impact on a student. But schools are the places where and universities are the places where we need to have these difficult conversations. And what you could see, like you see in Florida, is attempts for disciplinary action against teachers who introduce critical perspectives into the curriculum. And so students might go an entire K-12 experience without learning about key historical moments like the civil rights movement, slavery, women's rights, LGBTQ plus rights. That's a real challenge for us because it's historical censorship. Lessons on slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, segregation, they might be softened or altogether removed. And so the role of all communities, especially marginalized communities in shaping US history, could be erased or minimized. And so the framing of these historical events must not shift to a both sides conversation, about Nazi Germany, or a both sides conversation about slavery. We need to acknowledge our history and the injustices involved. Now, you asked a little bit about impact on books and libraries. Increasingly, book bans are targeting literature about race and gender and other identities. And so schools may begin to remove books. Like you see in Florida, you had parent associations trying to actively remove books because of new legislation in Florida. And so access to historical accounts, autobiographies of marginalized individuals could be restricted. So the impact on student expression in clubs, we could also see that. Schools may try to limit or disband student groups focused on race or gender or other identities. And students advocating for DEI may face backlash or be prevented from engaging in activism. We saw hints of that, and actually more than hints of that. You saw students arrested for protests this past year. You saw Harvard banning students from graduating. We actually have an article coming out about protest movements and how educational leaders should work with students in those contexts. So school policies may begin to prohibit discussions of identity in student-led forums and groups and other arenas. So much to be concerned for.
Yes, much to be concerned. So I have some follow-up questions, but I was wondering if you see in the future, near or far, national curriculum being pushed as Latin American countries and other places in the world.
Yeah, that's a great question. So as Carol talked about, we have a very decentralized system of higher education. And so curriculum decisions are primarily determined at the state and local levels. However, what we're seeing right now is that the federal government is trying to use funding incentives and or penalties and or withdrawing all funding. I think you saw the conversation. I mean, you may have seen the conversation between the Maine governor and Trump around whether he was going to send federal funding, and now she's responded that they won't send federal taxes, or these are the kinds of conversations that are happening right now. But right now the federal government does not have that power, and specifically in statute is not allowed to have that power. But they could use the power of the stick to try to influence a federal curriculum.
So in Illinois, we see a strong statements opposing these directives from state superintendents of education, Chicago Board of Education, etc. So the idea of not complying is the carrot, is the funding.
Right.
Are there other sources of revenue where the funding, so the states can be federal government free?
Well, this is a real challenge, and I actually talked about this on Democracy Now! on Friday. So yes, states like Illinois and California are pushing back. They've openly opposed such restrictions. You have states like Florida and Texas, which have embraced these types of policies. And then you have local school boards and districts within red states that vary in their level of compliance, and in some cases in blue states. But I think really we have to think about how education is funded. Federal dollars flow extensively to higher education and K-12 institutions through Title I, through research grants for higher education through NSF, IES, NIH. And so over the last 100 years, there's been an increased dependence on federal funding. Now, what's important about this is either we're going to have to rethink how we're funding our K-12 districts and our higher education institutions if there's going to be strings attached to those dollars. Because right now the strings are DEI and however they define that. But then tomorrow it could be, we won't give you federal funding if you don't have unions. And then the next day it could be, we will not give you federal funding if you teach liberal arts curriculum. You see in authoritarian nations like Russia, they ban liberal arts curriculum because of the critical thinking that comes with being a liberal arts student. And so there's going to be a question, an open question on whether you'll see patronage or whether you see districts and universities push back.
So very, very interesting. There's so much more to talk about. We're going to move on to another question regarding the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. It's been in the news lately. So before we talk about the latest developments around that, can you tell us what the Office of Civil Rights does and what would happen if it were to be eliminated? Yes. And also let's turn to the Dear Colleague letter as well, and the response that you sent that was wonderful and awesome from Craig Trainer, and briefly how you responded in your letter and your commentary. And then you also wrote a piece last week offering those suggestions. Yes. We only have a few other about 10 more minutes, but okay. And anything else you would like to talk about, because sure. you have a wealth of knowledge.
Wonderful. So let me quickly talk about OCR, which is at the Department of Education. So what does the Office of Civil Rights do? It enforces federal rights laws in education, including Title VI, which is about race and national origin discrimination, Title IX, which is about gender discrimination, and also Section 504, disability rights, which Carol talked about. And so they investigate complaints related to discrimination in K-12 and higher education. Now, the rumor out of DC is that the OCR has shut down thousands of complaints along these lines, thousands, and then taking up the number that sticks in my head is 40 complaints related to what they call reverse racism. I think at another time we can talk about perspectives about that. But what would happen if the Office of Civil Rights is weakened or eliminated? Schools would no longer be held accountable for discrimination based on race or gender or disability. Marginalized students could lose access to key protections and accommodations, such as students with disabilities. There'd be fewer consequences for schools that engage in discriminatory practices, and the burden of legal action would shift to families, to students, making it harder to challenge the multitude of violations that are reported to the U.S. Department of Education. Now, you'd asked me to talk about the letter. Let me set up the context. Craig Traynor is, I think, the assistant secretary in OCR. He sent a letter with a 14-day ultimatum. Now, what's in this letter? It really signals a shift in civil rights enforcement that would weaken protections for marginalized students and suggests that he has a more aggressive and limited interpretation of federal protections for race and gender, and raises concerns about rolling back established rights for students. So how did I respond to this? 14-day ultimatum, you must cancel DEI is essentially what the letter said to higher education. If you do, and K-12, if you do not cancel DEI, we will take away your funding. Now, the letter also said that it didn't have the force of law. And since that time, you have seen all sorts of litigation directed towards the Department of Education. In fact, the National Association of Diversity Officers, I don't know if that's the exact name, recently had a pause issued from a judge. So I think that's important to understand. So I think what are the things that I talked about in my blog, Cloaking Inequity? So it's a blog I've been writing for more than 12 years, had more than 1.2 million readers. 4 thoughts. 1, we have got to defend academic freedom and curriculum integrity, and that is for K-12 and higher ed. Districts, universities, colleges, we must resist federal overreach that seeks to dictate what educators can and cannot teach. Colleges, universities, districts need to reaffirm their commitment to academic freedom of educators by issuing statements and ensuring that educators have the primary decision-making ability for curriculum. So we also need to reject the mischaracterization of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I talked a little bit about that before, but diversity, equity, and inclusion is about student success. It's about student success. At Western Michigan, we set records for graduation. We set records for retention rates. We increased our African-American enrollment by 26%. And that's because we did targeted work for those communities. We also have sought to make it easier for veterans to transfer. So there's a whole set of things that we're doing to ensure student success. Now, I also think it's important that we push back against these threats, because authoritative style governments do not like it when you push back. And you already saw when we had the funding pause that could have affected student aid and student grants, that they pulled back from that complete pause of student of funding to higher education. So we need to make sure that we push back against the Department of Education's desire to withhold federal funding, and it should be legally scrutinized. As the courts right now are pausing a lot of these policies so that we have an opportunity to examine whether institutions and students' rights are being upheld. And then finally, we have to mobilize students and faculty in coalitions to advocate together for educational opportunity. Universities should engage students, faculty, and staff in advocacy efforts. I understand that a lot of institutions are trying to just keep their head down, but that's about fear. And that's what these policies are about. They're about making people fear. But hope is stronger than fear. So we need to equip our stakeholders with information about their rights and how to organize against restrictive policies that limit the freedom to learn.
Thank you for that. I'd like to do a follow-up question. You mentioned academic freedom, and I have another question later, the last question for the session. Can you speak to academic freedom? And then the follow-up also to your last comment You were a provost, and so you sat over there in the high-level decision-making and that fear from the administration in higher ed. Can you speak briefly to that?
So what it takes is courage. What it takes is we have to have leaders with courage and expertise. Now, this is one of the things I said in Democracy Now! When we're choosing department chairs, when we're choosing deans, when we're choosing presidents and provosts and superintendents and principals, typically we're looking at what is the pedigree of those folks that are going to sit around the table. Did they go to Harvard or Stanford? Were they a department chair or a dean? Those are all important things, but this is a new special moment. And now as we're thinking about who we hire as principals, as superintendents, as provosts, department chairs, et cetera, presidents, we need those folks to have courage. We need them to also have empathy and morality. So those are things that are so important. Our leaders are often so focused on surviving in the jobs that they're in that they lack courage. And so we have, for this modern moment, with the situation that we're facing related to funding, freedom to learn, freedom of speech, academic freedom, we have to have leaders that are 100% behind their stakeholders, 100% behind their faculty, their staff, and their students. And those leaders that botched the student protests, I have very little faith that they're not going to botch this moment too.
Thank you for that. So the last question we have is about college students who are attending the forum. What are some concerns about college scholarships, student clubs, student free speech? Do you have suggestions for how students can navigate and approach these policies and these times?
Yeah, you know, we talked a little bit about this earlier in terms of the fact that when we saw that pause on all government funding, there was a big concern that that would affect federal grants, the Pell Grants, that would affect financial aid coming from the federal government. You saw the 1890 scholars that are students who are pursuing agriculture degrees. That was paused by the current administration, and then a judge recently lifted that pause. And so there are across the spectrum a target on the back of students, on the backs of universities, on the backs of educators. But those pronouncements, those presidential desires can be legally challenged. That's why we have our courts. And so that potential loss of funding for student programs that support marginalized students, historically and minoritized students, is a big concern. And so ultimately that's gonna play out in the courts. So I think we all need to watch those lawsuits very carefully. I'm really worried about student clubs, especially student clubs that are officially affiliated with the university, that are focused on racial, ethnic, or LGBTQ. Like, for example, I'm worried about the Black Student Union on my campus. Will the administration push universities and colleges to increasingly scrutinize student-led clubs that focus on different populations? And student free speech. If you go all the way back to the Tinker case, where Tinker wanted to wear a black armband to her university to protest the Vietnam War. And so I'm very worried about increased restrictions, either from the Supreme Court or from a presidential pronouncement on protests, on activism, about discussions about systemic issues that our nation has. Universities are the places where students should be empowered to have the most difficult conversations, whether it's from the right or from the left. Universities are the place where those conversations should happen. So finally, just some advice for students. Stay informed. And I know it's so hard. You have exams, you have homework, you have other responsibilities, you have jobs, but stay informed on what's happening at the federal and state level. Engage in student movements, push back against restrictive policies. On our campus, we're working to organize the student leaders and so that those student leaders have those connections and are prepared for what comes next. Seek support from campus organizations, legal group, civil rights, NAACP, ACLU, if there's something that comes to your campus that worries you. And use student media. Look, students, I see you in your phone, on my, in my classes, on campus, you run into students, use social media platforms. TikTok, Insta, whatever it takes, raise awareness about these issues. One final thing. The reason why this is happening, and I wrote this in my blog, Cloaking Inequity Today, is because this generation is more prepared for this moment than my generation. And that's why this is happening, is because they are worried that we are going to make another generation like you, Generation Z. They know. And so it's up to you. Your time to lead is now.
Thank you so much for everything that you have said in 30 minutes. So informative, so much information, and thank you for being inspiring in your last words that we can't give up and we must resist and we must be informed. So thank you again for being with us. Deeply appreciated.
Thank you.
And with that, I would like to thank you both, Carol and Julian, for your wisdom. And I'd like to pass the baton on to Diane.
Thanks for me also for the two wonderful speakers. So we're going to turn now to some very concrete ideas, to some actions and ways that you who are attending can be involved. Those of us who support public education are all in this together, and collectively we can mobilize to push against harmful policies and directives coming from the administration, much as Dr. Vasquez highly suggested. There are lots of groups and organizations working to address these unpopular directives. Just a few: PTAs, teacher unions, and in a moment you'll hear about a March 4th National Day of Action that the teacher unions are sponsoring. Teacher professional organizations, college student groups, as Dr. Vasquez highly just mentioned, school boards, administrator groups, public advocacy groups such as the Network for Public Education, the ACLU, and others working on civil liberties and civil rights issues for students and teachers, a new group called Labor for Higher Education that, and this group is mobilizing against the freezes that have been instituted for important research at universities. There are education law professors arguing in court against clearly unlawful directives. The NAACP and other civil rights organizations are involved. The AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, we have a chapter here at DePaul. Immigrant rights groups, such as the Illinois Coalition of Immigrant and Refugee Rights, who are working to protect undocumented students and their families. I'm sure there are similar organizations in other states. The list is large. So we encourage you to find people, to join groups, to work with on the education issues you care about. And so for the rest of the time, we're going to be talking with people, offering you some ideas. I want to call back Carol first. Carol, can you come back on to tell us a little bit about the Network for Public Education, how individuals on this call can get involved, and maybe a few words about its coming conference.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Diane. The Network for Public Education was formed over 10 years ago by Diane Radich, education historian and phenomenal author and friend of public schools, and Anthony Cody, a public school teacher. And our mission is to protect, defend, and improve public education. That's what we focus on. Probably 90% of my time is really focused on stopping privatization and exposing the problems with the privatization of public education. So how do you become a member? Well, it doesn't cost you anything, which is always nice. All you need to do is sign up. You can sign up on our website, networkforpubliceducation.org, and you'll see Join the Movement. That's our C3. We also have a C4, MPE Action. And both of those organizations together we publish reports, we put out newsletters, we do action alerts that allow you very, very easily to contact your legislators. And our reports have really become part of the mainstream in reporting on different issues, so that I'm often called up by education reporters because they've read one of our reports, whether it be on charter schools or on vouchers or on the funding of your public schools. One of the very exciting things that we do is we have a conference, and they happen about every year and a half, usually alternate between fall and spring. And we have one coming up in Columbus, Ohio, which is not very far away if you're in Illinois. And that's going to be April 5th and April 6th. And at that conference, we'll have some outstanding speakers, including Tim Walz, who's going to be joining us, and others that you can see on our website. Equally exciting to listen to, as well as panels that are very, very informative on a variety of topics, from book bans to the science of reading, to vouchers, to charter schools, and to the importance of public education, community schools, and everything in between. And those panels have folks from all over the country, teachers and parents and scholars, who join together on particular topics. You have a wide choice. Registration is quite modest. Essentially, it pays for your food over the 2 days. And if you're interested in attending, please go to our website. That's networkforpubliceducation.org, and you will see right up the top 2025 conference. Make sure you register. We are closing registration shortly, and hotel rooms are going very fast. I'm not even sure if there are some left. But there are certainly rooms in other hotels in the area. And I hope you get involved. It's going to take all of us. Julian's right. And standing together with courage is what we're going to need to get through, at least till the next election.
One of the exciting things you'll find on the NPE website are all the scores, maybe hundreds of groups from all around the country who are part of the network. Small groups, large groups, local groups, state groups, right, Carol?
Absolutely, including groups from Illinois. Illinois Families for Public Schools. I think we've heard of that very important group, haven't we?
Okay, so I've invited 3 other people to talk a little bit about their work and their efforts. So first, I want to call up Monique Rideau-Smith. Monique, can you come on?
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
So I'm just going to introduce you really quick.
Okay.
So Monique is a former CPS, Chicago Public Schools middle school teacher. She is currently the director of union professional issues for the Illinois Federation of Teachers, a great advocate for K-12 teachers, and she's going to share some ideas with you.
Yes, and we also represent the IFT higher ed and also public employees. So yes, my name is Monique Rideau-Smith, and so I'm just going to talk briefly about 4 things that I think we really have to talk about in this moment. The first one is, school choice is anti-Black. It is grounded in anti-Blackness, and this entire attack on public education is really rooted in anti-Blackness and a disregard and disdain for Black people, because public education is a product of the Black liberatory imagination. It came from newly emancipated Black folks. And so the first thing that I just want to talk about is that we really have to face something in this moment. And it's something that the white billionaires who are currently running this country know, but that we haven't said out loud. And that is that there are those among us in this society who we have deemed as disposable. And we say this with our actions. We may not come out and say it in words, but we say it with our actions. And the way that we accept and even justify the ill treatment of Black people in this country, the legacy of that really does demonstrate and indicate that we see Black people as disposable. People were okay with electing a racist president because they felt they wouldn't feel the harm. They were okay with getting rid of federal jobs and DEI because those things were deemed as benefiting Black people. And so it's this anti-Blackness that didn't allow us to see that DEI isn't just about Black people. It's about women. It's about Army veterans. It's about people with disabilities. Anti-Blackness didn't allow farmers to see that they benefit from federal funds and subsidies. And so once again, we are in a place within our history in which anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism has cost us trillions of dollars, and it's going to cost us our collective well-being. And so if we do not show in our actions that we are not going to tolerate even the smallest subset of our population being marginalized or mistreated, the billionaires are going to continue to be able to divide us. If we think, oh, this only is going to impact Black people, or it's only going to impact the paraprofessionals, or it's only going to impact the immigrants or undocumented folks or the trans folks or our higher ed folks, we will not win this fight. Yes, we may win a few battles here and there, but these folks, our enemies of public education, they are in this for the long game. And so solidarity has to show up. It has to mean showing up for those who have been traditionally and historically harmed in our schools, in our workplaces, in our unions. And it's showing up not just when it's convenient or when it's politically popular or when you feel like you're going to be directly impacted. It's about showing up for those folks who have been traditionally marginalized and traditionally excluded, right? So the second thing that I wanted to note, and Dr. Haley really spoke to this, is that On Tyranny, which is a book by Timothy Snyder, the first rule during tyranny and authoritarian times is you do not concede or comply in advance. And so again, the letter that was sent regarding the threats of 14 days and you have to eliminate all of your race-based programs, it does not have the force of law. In Illinois, we have curriculum mandates. We have laws that require that we teach in our public K-12 schools, Black history, Asian American history, Indigenous American history, women's history, the history of North American genocide, and also the genocides that have occurred and are occurring in our modern day, the history and contributions of LGBTQ folks, because all of these stories make up the American story, because they are all important to having a comprehensive understanding of the society in which we live. And so the letter from the DOE, any executive orders do not supersede these state laws. So we should not be complying. We should not be getting rid of our curriculum that delves into these issues or into these particular groups or our clubs. As a matter of fact, again, we need to double down on them. So my third point is that even though in Illinois we do have these curricular mandates, we really have to think about how many public school teachers are actually following the mandates that are law. If we weren't doing it before, it's unlikely that we're going to do so now. Teachers teach concepts that they are confident and competent in, and that is research-based. So one of the things that we're going to be doing as a union, the Illinois Federation of Teachers, is we're going to be hosting workshops on how to engage in culturally relevant pedagogy, how to design lessons that tackle what's happening in students' real world. So I'm really encouraging educators as a team, find teachers, find resources, take professional learning together, take PDs together, administrators, encourage and support your educators. Join with them in doing this. We have to do this collectively together. This cannot be one or two teachers in a building. It has to be a collective effort. It cannot be that we are leaving culturally relevant pedagogy and teaching up to one or two teachers or our teachers of color. Those folks are already the ones being targeted. So we have to do this collectively across grade levels, across disciplines. That is how we're going to make it much more difficult to disrupt. Also, when talking about learning and curriculum, tap into your community organizations within your school community. Find spaces outside of the school building to learn, to organize, and to congregate, right? The school is just one place where learning happens, is not the only place. And for many of us, folks of color, many of us learned about our history and our origins outside of school. So we have to tap back into that fugitive pedagogy. Last but not least, number 4, is that not only must we not comply, we have to resist, and we have to do so out loud in visible ways, as been mentioned. So on March 4th, across the country, the American Federation of Teachers and also the National Education Association is sponsoring a day of action in which we will indeed march forth. We're going to demonstrate our support and commitment to public education. So you can and you should participate. It can mean a wide range of different kinds of activities. It can be organizing a local event with your school community. It could be hosting a rally, doing a walk-in with your students, doing informational picketing with students, and also talking to parents. It can be a press conference. The Chicago Teachers Union will be wearing their union t-shirts and doing walk-ins with their students in the morning. And they're also will be providing information to parents before and after school about what's at stake and what they are fighting for. Our Cook County community colleges, they're going to be hosting a town hall on March 4th. So there are lots of different ways that you can get involved. You can contact your Congress people, especially those who have Republican Congress and lawmakers. Posting on social media, anything that you decide to do, again, making it visible, even if it's all of the teachers in your building wearing a t-shirt that is advocating for and saying, we will defend public education. Anything that you can do, lift up, make it visible, post on social media. You can get all kinds of different ideas at aft.org/protectourkids. There's going to be use of the hashtag #ProtectOurKids, but on that website, you can see lots of different things that other people are doing across the country and also here in Illinois, and you can also get ideas. We also have things listed at IFT's website, so IFT-AFT.org/standup. Again, there are many different kinds of activities and many different ways to participate. But the point is that we need to do something, and we need to do it out loud. Take pictures, document what you're doing, post them so that we can demonstrate that we will not go quietly into that good night. We are here to protect public education, and we will utilize every power we have to do so.
Thank you, Monique, and I hope all the teachers, and I know there are many here at this forum, will take advantage of everything you have to say. So now I'm going to turn to Cassie Cresswell. Cassie, can you come on? Cassie is the Executive Director of Illinois Families for Public Schools. This is a statewide public education advocacy group that works on legislation and policy that impacts public schools. And she's going to be talking specifically about what all of us can do to work against the privatization efforts to defeat the national voucher plans coming from the executive order and legislation. Cassie.
Hi, thank you so much, Diane. Let me try to share my screen and share this. I made a few slides about this. Okay, and let me try to share it as a slideshow. So I have a little bit.ly that so you could follow along and find these later. It's bit.ly/winterforum take action. And I'll show this at the end as well. And that QR code goes there too. So there's two federal initiatives right now on school vouchers. One is the presidential executive order that was issued in January. And so that's something that's coming out of the White House. And then there's legislation that Congress is considering. It's known as the Educational Choice for Children Act. And I will cover both of these and have a little very concrete action step that you can take with respect to both. So this executive order on school privatization, it does not have the force of law like a lot of these executive orders. And in particular, it's really about various federal agencies and departments trying to come up with plans for redirecting federal funds that states are already getting for public schools and figuring out ways and guidance to give states on how they could instead spend that money on private schools. So there has been some pushback from Congress on this executive order. 45 members of Congress sent a letter to the president calling on him to rescind that order and instead support public schools, including 9 of our congresspeople from Illinois. We have 17. So one great concrete action you can do on this is to find your US rep. I have a link on here. If you just Google find my member of Congress, that's what comes up. Check the list of who signed this letter. And then when you call, you want to say, either thanking them for signing, or if they didn't sign, you want to say, oh, hey, I didn't see my representative's signature on this letter that was calling on the president to rescind his executive order on privatizing public schools. I want to know where my representative stands on school vouchers and the goals of that executive order. And I want them to work to ensure that public dollars aren't going to be diverted. If your rep did sign it, you could say thank you. And you can also urge them to oppose a federal voucher program that Congress would create. I'll give you some more details on that. So separately from this executive order, which wouldn't really change existing law in any way, is an effort to actually change the law and create a federal school voucher program for K-12. This was actually passed in a committee in the House last fall, but what's being considered now is even bigger than that. It would be $10 billion a year for 10 years. The voucher distribution would be very lightly regulated and done by third-party nonprofits. The vouchers would be unlimited in size. They could be given to families with very high incomes. And essentially the legislation prohibits states from regulating any of this. So you really have no power at the state level to, one, not have vouchers at all. And our state, for example, decided to end a school voucher program just last year. So this would overrule that. And on top of that, states would be forbidden from regulating the schools getting these vouchers, and including prohibiting them from discriminating. So in addition, the law would let money be used in a way similar to what Carol was talking about earlier, education savings accounts, where money in sort of these more like flexible voucher programs can be spent on anything from homeschooling to online schooling, to really some really out there stuff that's just not regulated at all. And so the way this program is designed, it would be done as a tax credit scholarship. This essentially just means that instead of the US Treasury directly paying private schools these to cover tuition dollars, the money is diverted and wealthy contributors get a tax credit on top of the whole program's issues. And because it is done this way, it could be part of reconciliation budget bill process. So you may have heard in the news last night, the House has just passed their sort of like the first step in the reconciliation bill. And this voucher program could be part of that. And because it would be snuck in with all kinds of other devastating attacks on the public good and cuts on public spending, then it would sort of be snuck in through that. So an action you can take on that is also calling your US representative, but also your US senators. Our senators here in Illinois are Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth. They really need to be hearing from people about public education and the problems that a federal voucher program would cause. So we have a little script here that you can use. And we also have a really easy action that you can email your US rep and your US senators about this federal voucher program. That also has a little bit.ly/no vouchers Illinois. So all lowercase. Yeah, so those links will get you to the phone numbers that you need to call your reps and senators. I really recommend this program, this app, 5calls.org. So you can use your own scripts with it, but it really is helpful in terms of getting you all the different office phone numbers, especially because there's just been this flood of activity, and which is great, with people contacting their elected officials, especially their federal elected officials. Sometimes you need to call a branch office essentially instead of the Washington, D.C. office to really get through and have a conversation with an actual staffer. So that app, 5calls.org, is really good for that. So that was quick, but if you go to this link, then you'll get to the slides.
Thank you, Cassie. We're going to be sending out a recording, and there's been tons of information, and you'll be able to access this again, as well as some resources that Monique suggested and other really great articles. So finally, I want to call on Dr. Danya Matos. Dr. Matos is the DePaul Vice President for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. She's going to close out our forum offering ideas for the way forward for colleges and universities during these really unprecedented times. Dr. Matos.
Thank you so much, Diane. And I have the honor and privilege of closing us out and getting you to sort of whatever's next. So I just want to thank you for being in community with us today as well. So many incredible insights and folks that are doing this. I really want to acknowledge and uplift, right, the chaos of this moment. And one thing I know is that chaos is intended to destabilize us, right, so that we can be divided and controlled. And one thing that's clear about tonight is that I know who we are, I know who this community is, and we're not going to let that happen. And so really thinking about a world where everyone can live with dignity and we can uplift the human dignity of all is going to take radical imagination and all the actions you named here tonight. So I just wanted to lift up a couple of different points that were lifted up today. One of the conferences that Dr. Vasquez-Helling mentioned was the National Associations of Diversity Officers in Higher Ed. It's going to be taking place in Chicago, March 5th through 8th, nadahe.org. And the theme is going to be on navigating change and leading through defining moments. They are one of the organizations who successfully were granted a preliminary gut injunction. And so they're going to be talking also about the legal strategies. One of the things I also wanted to lift up is so many different organizations and bodies are starting monthly or weekly or bi-weekly community care check-ins, which have also been really great strategy sessions. So if it's not a formalized organization that you're going to join, see if you can create that amongst each other. That has been such a sustaining life force during this time, and reminder that survival is also an act of resistance, right? So how are you caring for yourselves and each other? This time becomes absolutely important. And then I have a legal background and just wanted to say that compliance and legality are two distinct concepts. And so those actions of diversity, equity, inclusion that were legal before continue to be legal now. And so this concept of sort of anticipatory compliance becomes so important that so many people talked about today. And so we're going to continue leading with love and that hope that we all need. And we will remember this moment when we look back. So thank you for a wonderful evening. And I'm going to turn it back to Diane.
I want to thank all of you. Again, you'll receive a recording with all these resources, and we're going to end with Sonia Soltero.
So thank you. Well, thank you, Diane, for putting this together. It's been amazing and truly inspirational in a frightening way, but inspirational because we can't give up. So a heartfelt thank you to our distinguished guests, speakers, Julian and Carol, and the respondents, Danya, Monique, and Cassie, thank you. And all of you who took the time out of your busy schedules to attend tonight's forum, thank you again. In this existential moment in history, we must stand together to uphold the fundamental tenets of democracy and the dignity and the rights of all people, and to defend public education and to defend higher education. And with that, thank you again, and continue your advocacy efforts and continue to be involved and engage in resistance. Thank you again, and good night.